Harold would never forget the strange house in the middle of the cul-de-sac. There were all sorts of rumors about that house, but most were just the stories children made up to explain strange things. The local kids said that the woman who lived there was a witch. They said that she kidnapped and ate children. They said that if you went by that house at night, you could see strange lights coming from the basement, and sometimes you could hear screams after dark. They claimed that she had lived there for years and years, and that the old woman had existed there for generations. When Harold asked his mother about these things, she said that Mrs. Renfro was just a lonely old lady who lived all alone. However, his friend Davy Parker insisted that she was a witch. If she's just a normal old lady, how come animals won't go into her house? On that, he was right. Not all animals, Harold supposed. Mostly just cats. Cats would not come anywhere near Miss Renfro's house. There were many strays on the road, cats squatting in people's yards to hunt mice or snakes, but none of them would go anywhere near Miss Renfro's house. The cats wouldn't even use the sidewalk in front of her fence. You could watch them sometimes, as they stopped at the fence line and crossed the street instead, risking being hit by traffic instead of walking near her home. It was as if there was a magnetic pulse around the place that repelled members of the feline race. She owned cats, of course. The boys had seen her take many of them into the house, all of them hissing and yowling as they battered against their carrier. Once they went in, though, they never saw any of them again. There was talk around town that the local animal shelter wouldn't give her cats anymore. They said that she'd been housing about 4 to 5 a year for as long as anyone could remember. But when a well check found that none of the cats were on the premises, they had stopped letting her foster them. That didn't stop her from getting them, though. She had traps that she set up around town and worked out a deal with the local dog catcher to bring her cats when he found them. Mr. Barley was not what you would call a nice guy. He was mean enough to dogs, and most people would believe that he would trap cats for her. His son Thomas was a big brute, known for throwing bags of animals into the local river for entertainment. He'd been picked up by the police a time or two for hurting people's pets, and that kind of behavior was usually learned from somewhere. Harold and his friends, Ralph, Stephen, and Davy, had been watching the house for as long as they could remember. Mrs. Renfro never decorated for holidays. She never handed out candy for Halloween. She never returned any of the balls or toys that might land in her yard, and chased away anyone who tried to retrieve them. No one ever went there to sell magazines or chocolate bars for school fundraisers, and if they tried, they were always chased away. Mrs. Renfro was a sour old woman, somewhere in her late 50s or early 60s, but there was talk that she might have been older than that. Harold's mother told him about how Mrs. Renfro had acted the same way when she was a kid. It couldn't have been the same Mrs. Renfro, though it does look just like her. She constantly ran kids off her property, or yelled at those who rode their bikes too close to the fence. She was a sour old crone, but this must be her daughter or a cousin or something. The Mrs. Renfro that I knew would be older than dirt by now. She told the boys this story as they sat eating watermelon on the back porch one summer, and it sparked a real fire in them. They wanted to know more about Mrs. Renfro, and in their minds, it could absolutely be the same one. Her reputation for being a wicked old witch had been cemented in the minds of most of the town's children. The idea that she had existed there for multiple generations wasn't as far-fetched as Harold's mom had thought it was. So, as they started their school break, the boys began spying on their reclusive neighbor. Like the nerd he was, Ralph wanted to start with the boring bits. "We should go to the library. We can see if they have the same Mrs. Renfro that lived there when Harold's mom was a kid." "And how are we going to do that?" Davy asked. "You know they're not going to let a bunch of kids go and look at records like that. Those kinds of things are only for lawyers and policemen. The two had argued about it, but in the end, they had decided that some good old-fashioned surveillance might be their best option. So, they had staked out the old lady's house for the next week. The boys left on their bikes around daybreak and got a good spot on Davy's front porch. Davy's house was right across from hers on the cul-de-sac and had the best view of her front yard. They stayed and watched the house until the street lights came on, all of them racing for home before they got into trouble. The street lights meant it was dinner time, and missing dinner would make their mothers into bigger monsters than that mean old witch, Mrs. Renfro. After 5 days, the boys hadn't seen much, besides Mrs. Renfro coming home with a new cat in a carrier. Davy was getting frustrated as the sun set on Friday afternoon. "This is stupid," he said as he threw his binoculars against the grass. "We've given up 2 perfectly good baseball games, a bike race with Mark Hollister, and a chance to go to the movies on Thursday, just to watch this old lady's house." "Well, how else do you think we're going to find anything out?" Harold asked. Davy thought about it for a minute, and then he got an idea. He went inside, and the other 3 boys heard him talking to his mother. He was using his pleading voice, the voice he put on when he was trying to convince her to give him some money or let him do something. They all knew he would manage whatever he was after. Davy's mom was a soft touch, and always had been. After a little back and forth, they heard him exclaim how much he loved her and come back outside. He had his chest puffed out as he came to join them, and a smile that made him look like the cat that had caught the canary. "Ask your parents when you get home tonight if you can stay on Saturday. I think most of the good stuff happens after dark, so we can watch from the front windows and catch it." They all agreed, saying that sounded like a great idea. Davy's dad, a trucker who was on the road more than not, was still off on a delivery. Davy's mom was the doting sort, who loved to give her son whatever he wanted. That meant that even if they didn't catch Mrs. Renfro in anything, they could still play Super Nintendo or watch scary movies in his room. Even if they didn't solve the mystery of the neighborhood witch, it would still be a fun night. To no one's surprise, their parents agreed to let them stay the night, and as the sun began to set Saturday night, all 4 were in the living room with their binoculars out. Davy's mother had told them to not make too much racket and gone up to read in her bed. They were trying to be sneaky, but anyone could have seen the binoculars hiding underneath Mrs. Parker's gauzy curtains in the living room. It had been a slow day on watch, and the boys hadn't seen Mrs. Renfro leave her house all day. They supposed she might have snuck out while they were eating lunch or munching on the pizza that Davy's mom had bought them, but they doubted it. Her old van was still in the same position, and the package the postman had left that morning was still sitting on the doorstep. It had been an all-day event, and the boys almost vibrated with excitement as they watched the sun set behind her creepy old house. As darkness began to fall, Stephen said he thought he saw something from one of the basement windows. They all looked in that direction, and sure enough, there was something going on down there. A weird funhouse glow was coming from the windows, a soupy green color, like you saw in scary movies. Davy said he thought he saw smoke, too, and the longer they looked, the more the boys imagined that they could see smoke curling up from underneath the windowsill. Not the kind of smoke you got from a fire, of course. This was soft and translucent, like the smoke you saw when your mom made soup. "I knew it! I knew if we stayed past dark we'd see something." Harold thought the glow was cool, but it wasn't really proof of anything. For all they knew, that's where she kept her TV, and she was just watching something weird. Maybe she was down there smoking the stuff that he caught his sister puffing on behind the house, and they were watching no more than her relaxing after a long day of being terrible. Either way, the glow wasn't much proof of anything. "We need to get closer," someone said. It wasn't until Harold found the other 3 looking at him that he realized he had been the one to say it. "That's a great idea," Davy said, putting down his binoculars. He looked pretty excited about the prospect of sneaking up on the old woman's house, but Harold suddenly wished he hadn't said anything. Mrs. Renfro's house was creepy enough in the daytime, and the idea of going over her fence at night was a little too spooky for him. It was just a thought, guys. If she caught us sneaking over there after dark, she'd have we can go out the back and creep around the side of the house, Davy said, clearly not listening. My mom will never hear the door and think we've just gone up to my room if she comes downstairs. Stephen and Ralph were all for it, though Harold thought Ralph looked a little queasy. Just to be safe, they all went running up the stairs like a herd of gazelles to get their flashlights from their backpack. They had all brought them with the idea of telling scary stories later that night. But they might be put to better use now. Once they had them, they snuck back downstairs as quietly as they could and managed to make their way out the back door. There was still a little stab of daylight left as they came through Davy's backyard and around the front of the house. As they crossed the street in a mad hustle, it dipped below the horizon and left them in darkness. At least until the street lights came on in a small flurry of snapping bulbs. They stood beneath one of the lamplights, crouching low as they observed the front of Mrs. Renfro's house. The front lawn was covered in tall grass and weeds, children's toys dotting it like pirate treasure. From behind all the tall grass, they could see the green glow as it came from the small windows. The boys hopped the low fence as they snuck through the hip-high grass and up to the windows. As they lay on their bellies and looked down through those slats, Harold could see that Mrs. Renfro was not, in fact, watching TV and relaxing after a long day. What they saw seemed to be better proof that she was a witch. The basement looked identical to the one in Harold's house. A single steep staircase ran down into a concrete room with shelves and hooks on the wall. The floor, a flat sheet of concrete. Instead of a washer, a dryer, and a mound of holiday decorations, however, a large metal pot sat in the middle of the floor. The pot, more like a bathtub than a soup pot, was the source of the green glow, and the liquid inside swirled with eldritch light. Mrs. Renfro was stirring it with a long spoon or maybe a broom handle, and though her mouth was moving, none of them could tell what she was saying. On a shelf near the pot was the cat they had seen her bring in a few days before. "Holy crap," whispered Ralph, pushing away from the window. "She really is a witch." Harold nodded, all of them moving back from the window so she couldn't see them. But Davy stayed put. He was focused on that cat, the one on the shelf that she was clearly planning to do something with. Harold didn't really like how intent he was. Davy was prone to doing things that weren't strictly smart sometimes, things that might be considered noble if they weren't so suicidal. Last summer, Davy had saved a kid from drowning at Gopher Pond, an act that had almost sent him under as well. The year before, he had shoved a kid out of the way of a truck, earning himself a broken arm and a commendation from the mayor. Davy didn't lack for courage. Sometimes he lacked for sense, though. When he picked up the rock, Harold was afraid that he might throw it through the little window and give them away. Instead, he rolled like a log and tossed it at Miss Renfro's front door. The old woman stiffened, climbing down off her stool as she hobbled towards the stairs on her gouty legs. "What are you doing?" Harold whispered, looking at Davy incredulously. "Getting that cat," Davy said. As she got to the top of the stairs, he pushed the window and grinned as it popped inward. He slid inside as Ralph began to hyperventilate, and Stephen asked what the heck he thought he was doing. Harold whispered he didn't know, but quieted as the front door came open and a quavery voice cascaded across the lawn. "Who is it?" she croaked, sounding more like a bullfrog than a woman. "What nasty beasties are taking me from my work?" The three boys got as low as they could in that tall grass, hoping it would cover them as the specter descended the steps. "Are you hiding?" she rasped. the stairs squeaking under her feet as her bunched old legs brought her closer to the yard. Harold put a hand over Ralph's mouth as his wheezing became louder. He undoubtedly needed his inhaler, but the sound of its trigger would alert the old biddy. Stephen had begun to shimmy a little, trying to get around the edge of the house, but as her patent leather shoe came down with a clump on the cobblestone path in front of her, he froze like a statue. If she had a flashlight, they'd be seen, but Harold didn't think she had one. She hadn't turned on the porch light either, and with any luck, her old eyes wouldn't see them if they stayed absolutely still. She took a step into the grass, and Harold almost pulled his hand away as he felt Ralph's tears touch his skin. She took another, and Harold thought she might be casting a spell before he realized it was just Stephen, quietly praying. She took a third step, and Harold shut his eyes tight as he hoped beyond hope that she wouldn't see them. The seconds slipped on for an indeterminate time, but finally she turned and hobbled back up the stairs. When the door closed, they all breathed a sigh of relief before pulling back to the window to see if Davy had been caught. Not only had Davy not been caught, but as they caught sight of him, he was lifting the cat carrier off the shelf. He had taken the stepladder that the witch had been standing on and was reaching on tiptoes to grasp the side of the cat carrier. None of them could hear if the cat was cooperating, but it didn't look as if Davy was going to manage to get the cage off the shelf without dropping it. Harold had just shimmied to go help him when the croak of the witch brought him up short and sealed Davy's fate. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" she screeched, and Davy must have jumped because he was suddenly falling towards the tub of glowing liquid. The cat carrier fell to the concrete with a smack, and a small white animal shot out like a cannonball as it tore off towards the upstairs. It ran right between the startled legs of the crone, but she was more interested in the boy that was now bobbing in her cauldron. They both began to scream simultaneously. Mrs. Renfro doubled over, falling down the stairs as she clutched at her stomach. She was still when she came to rest on the concrete, but Harold could see her twitching as whatever was happening took effect. The tub could not have been deeper than a foot or two, but Davy was suddenly splashing like a drowning man. He was shrinking, his skin growing taut and spotted, his hair growing gray and brittle. His teeth fell out, floating in the soup before dissolving into nothing. His eyes joined them, his skeletal hands still grasping at hope. As they watched, their friend shuddered out a last few moments of his life, his body dissolving as he sank into the tub. They ran screaming from the yard, thundering into Davy's house as they went to find the closest adult they could. The police were there before they could finish telling it all, and the 4 squad cars lit up the cul-de-sac like a Christmas light show. Harold's father was amongst them, being one of the deputies for their little town, which was how Harold found out more than he strictly wanted to the next day. Harold had gone home with his mother, Mrs. Parker speaking with the police as she begged them to find her son. He had gone to sleep on the couch under the scratchy afghan his mother had crocheted, and dreamed about the pool of liquid in Mrs. Renfro's basement. In the dream, Davy's skeleton had burst out of it as he stood beside the cauldron, grabbing him and trying to drag him in. It screamed and screamed, his ears ringing with it, and when he tossed and turned his way off the couch, he awoke to find his mother and father talking in the kitchen. Old Biddy was kinda nuts. She had all these books and diagrams, satanic stuff. She had this big tub of liquid down there. The coroner thinks it's acid or something, but they aren't really sure. He paused, and Harold almost heard the shudder in his father's voice. They found bone fragments at the bottom of the tub. They aren't sure, but they think they might be human. Did they find any sign of Davy? His mother asked. Not really. They can't be sure that the bone fragments are his, but if the boy's story's right, I guess they'd have to be. I hope that terrible woman rots in prison, his mother half whispered, expressing more venom in her words than Harold had ever heard from her before. Not unless we find her, he said unhappily. She was gone when we arrived. How far could she have gotten? She'd have to be pushing 100. I don't know, but the journals I found will stick with me for a long time. She was... He shuddered a little, and Harold peeked around the corner of the couch to snoop on his parents. She was killing cats. She talked about how she would drown them in that tub and steal their lives. Steal their lives? Cats are supposed to have 9 lives. She was stealing their lives to stay alive. She was so delusional. She thought the cats were keeping her from dying. The journal entries went way, way back, long before you and I were born. She was a sick woman who believed she'd lived for centuries. Mrs. Renfro's house sat empty for a long time. The families that moved in never stayed for long. They always said the same thing. They told the realtor that the house was lovely, but they felt watched while they were there. The toys disappeared from the yard, reclaimed by their owners, but Harold and his friends never returned to that house again. Davy's family moved away a few months after his disappearance. His mother couldn't deal with the loss of her son, and his house was soon occupied by a new family. Time went on. Harold and his friends returned to school. People forgot about Davy and Mrs. Renfro. A news story began to circulate, though, as the stories always do. Kids claimed to see a young woman walking the streets at night. She would lure children away, singing to them and telling them how she wanted to play. She was said to be luring more than a few teens away as well, though Harold doubted she had offered to play with them. There were reports of people missing, but never enough to spark much panic. They could be chalked up to runaways or kids lost in the woods, and the town continued. Harold knew that they were more than stories, though. He saw the woman outside his window most nights, he and Stephen and Ralph. She called to them, telling them to come and play. She told them that Davy missed them, and they could see him again if they wanted. When they refused her or ignored her, she would go into the woods behind their houses, disappearing into the shadows. Sometimes they could see a strange green glow from the woods late at night. Harold wondered how many years Mrs. Renfro had gotten from Davy, and how many more she would get before the town finally put an end to her. It was a pretty normal thing to ask of a cat. Catch the rat and get your reward. I moved recently, and somehow I got a rat in my stuff. The apartment I had moved from was kind of a dump, but I'd never had a problem with rats. So when I opened the box and out came a big black wharf rat, I nearly had a heart attack. It came barreling out of the box and ran right behind my stove, all 3 of my cats watching it curiously from the top of the couch where they were perched. I remember glowering at them, little cowards, but being madder at Calvin more than the others. The other 2 were little more than kittens, half-grown and barely out of eating dry food soaked in gravy. Calvin, however, was a full-grown cat. I hadn't set out to have 3 cats in a 1-bedroom apartment, of course. It just kind of happened by mistake. Calvin had been a birthday present from my mom. He'd been a scrawny little orange kitten, and she had meant for him to keep me company in my new studio apartment. She had pulled him out of her pocket with a little flourish, and I had sighed as I tried to refuse him. He was very cute, his inquisitive amber eyes looking around with curiosity, but I really didn't want something to take care of right now. Keep him for the weekend. If you still don't want him, I'll come back and get him, she said. By Monday, you couldn't have taken him from me by any means less than high explosive. He was a playful little thing, always zooming around and getting into trouble, and I spent many nights with him curled up in my lap or sitting on my feet as I went to sleep. After a few months, though, he became kind of sluggish and mopey. I talked to a friend of mine, and she said he was probably lonely. She told me that cats are social creatures, and that it might perk him up if he had a little playmate. I talked to Mom, and she told me that the lady she'd gotten Calvin from had just had another litter of kittens. Calvin's brother cousin would probably be ready to leave his mom soon, and I could have a little friend for Calvin to play with. That's how Hobbs came to be my new addition. Before he could even arrive, though, I found Grayson. I was just walking through the Dollar General parking lot, just wanting to get a few things for dinner, when this pathetic little mew from under a giant truck caught my attention. He was a half-starved little gray kitten, scared and lost and looking for help. He was too small to even fight me when I picked him up and put him in my shirt pocket. I picked up a few things while I was inside, a water bowl and some wet food, and Grayson joined my growing little brood of cats. Calvin hated him at first, hissing and spitting at this interloper. But after a few weeks, I saw them playing and running together like old friends. Grayson seemed to idolize Calvin. And when I brought Hobbs home, the two of them hissed and spit at him until they finally accepted him as part of their world. The Littles, as I started calling them, followed Calvin around ceaselessly, and he was a good big brother and showed them how to be productively mischievous, as house cats often are. Then, when I got a raise at work, finally making the sort of money that could change my life, I moved out of my dingy studio apartment and into a nice 2-bedroom in a better part of town. And now, I had a rat. I spent the first 2 weeks in my new apartment ignoring him. I could hear him scuttling around, but I hoped he would leave on his own. I had 3 cats after all. Rats are supposed to leave if they smell a cat, right? This fellow didn't care about the existence of my timid little felines, though. He ate my snack cakes from the cupboard, torn into my breakfast cereal, and chewed holes in my bread and dry goods. After the 3rd morning of grabbing a cereal box and finding the contents spilling out onto the linoleum, I got angry. That's when I started trying to get rid of the damn rat. I put out traps, I put down glue boards, I bought poison and put it out in places that I knew would be hard for the cats to get to. I filled any hole I could find with steel wool and spray foam and hot pepper granules. When that failed to get the results, I hired an exterminator to come and have a look. To my surprise, he put down traps and bait and said he'd be back in a week. I rolled my eyes after he left, thinking that I had already done all that. When that failed to get any result too, I started getting desperate. I bought those little noise generator things that are supposed to drive rats crazy. I bought candles that are supposed to make them go nuts. I used essential oils and left out different smelly foods that are supposed to drive them away. Nothing made any progress, though. That's when I really started to get angry at my cats. I shouldn't have taken out my frustration on them, but I was becoming ridiculous. There's 3 of you. How is it that you can't catch one freaking rat? He's been eating your cat food too, you know, chewing holes straight into the bag. Are you really going to let him get away with that? The 3 of them just stared at me blankly, not understanding a damn thing I said. Okay, how about this? The first one of you who gets that rat gets a can of wet food. The good stuff, too. The $3 a can stuff. That seemed to perk them up. Once the cats were out of kittenhood, I had weaned all of them off of wet food. I hadn't given them wet food in nearly 6 months, and they had spent the last 3 months mewing and looking at me expectantly anytime I opened a can of soup or ravioli. Cats aren't stupid. I had always suspected as much, and the way the 2 smaller ones looked at each other left little doubt that they were plotting something. Grayson and Hobbs were younger than Calvin, and they often worked together to manage mischief pretty well. Calvin, on the other hand, looked thoughtfully and stared off at the kitchen. Later that night, as I curled up in bed, I noticed that Calvin was missing from my usual cuddle pile. Grayson was sprawled across my chest, Hobbs laying on my pillow as his fluffy body lay across the top of my head, but Calvin's comfortable weight was absent from my legs. Calvin had slept across my legs every night since he'd come to stay with me, and it was strange now to be thinking about sleep without him there. I called him, patting the bed and pss-pss-pssing at him, but he refused to come to bed. Finally, I just rolled over and went to sleep. He'd turn up. When he finally turned up, it was to show me the dead wharf rat dangling from his teeth. I woke up slowly as the big yellow cat put his paws on my chest.
I opened my eyes and saw the dead rat hanging inches from my face. I struggled awake, startled back to consciousness, as the cat proudly held the rat by the tail and dangled it in front of me. The other two came sniffing around, looking reverently at Calvin and his prize, but he hissed and spit as he scared them back. This was his prize alone. He followed me into the kitchen, the rat still swinging as I looked through the cabinets for any wet food we might have left over. I found a can of Old Fancy Feast, something I had picked up for a special occasion, and when it went plop into the bowl, he dropped the rat and began to eat. As he dipped his head to eat, I got my first look at the rat. It was unbloodied, its fur unruffled from a fight, and the way its body had curled made me think that Calvin had jumped on him and broken his back. I swept him into a dustpan and dumped him out onto the fire escape, leaving him out there for the scavengers to pick apart. I heard Calvin hiss at the littles as they came close, scattering them before he went back to eating. I reflected that it might have been a mistake to introduce Calvin to wet food again. Calvin had, after all, been the hardest to break. He had never really had it before the kittens came into the house, to my knowledge. He'd been big enough for dry food when Mom brought him to me. Until Grayson had come, he had never had a taste. Grayson had been small, much smaller than Calvin, and I had quickly learned that they could not eat anywhere near each other. Calvin would take Grayson's food without hesitation, snarfing up all the wet food as quickly as possible. It didn't seem to matter if it made him sick or not. He would fill his belly with as much wet food as he could get, and then flop down in a contented ball. It got to the point where I had to feed Grayson in my bedroom, the poor little kitten wasting away as his food was stolen again and again. I did the same with Hobbs, but Calvin still seemed to find a way to take their food sometimes. Calvin was sneaky, and when his amber eyes found something they wanted, he tended to get it. I should have known when he flopped over, his belly full, that this wouldn't be the last. The next night, as I was getting ready for bed, I walked into my room and yelped in horror as I nearly tripped over a second dead rat. This one was a little smaller, a little more normal rat-sized than the wharf rat Calvin had brought me the night before. As I inspected it, he crept silently up and butted my leg. He looked pleased with himself, looking at me expectantly as he waited for his prize. I tried to be supportive of his latest kill, admonishing him as I put out what little wet food I still had. I made a mental note to get more tomorrow. He watched me smugly as I came home with 2 more cans, hoping I wouldn't need them. He took that night off, but the next night, 2 small mice were in front of my bedroom door. This was becoming ridiculous. How was my apartment this infested? I hadn't seen so much as a roach or a mouse turd anywhere other than from the big rat that Calvin had killed. Not in the cabinets, not behind the fridge, not anywhere. Suddenly, Calvin was turning up with 4 to 5 times the number of rodents I had thought I had, and that was a problem. I made a note to call an exterminator the next day and disposed of the carcasses. I gave him the wet food and went to bed, figuring I would have a long day tomorrow. I called the exterminator on my lunch break, and he agreed to come out that afternoon. He met me at the door to my apartment, wearing an orange jumpsuit and carrying a heavy can of poison. He introduced himself as Mark. He asked me what I had going on, and I told him that my cats had been catching a lot of vermin since I moved in. He said that was pretty common, especially this close to the canal, and he said he'd have a look. The littles immediately came over to rub up against him, but I noticed that Calvin was keeping his distance. He looked at the exterminator distrustfully, keeping his perch atop the bookcase as his tail flicked unhappily. Mark set to work immediately, checking under the counters and shining his UV light around as he tried to find the rat's sign. He went through the kitchen, the bathroom, my bedroom, and finally checked the living room before making his way into my office. He said he hadn't found any rat sign, other than a small amount of scat under the sink. He said it looked like a single rat might have been here briefly, but that would explain the stowaway I found in my belongings. But what about the other 3, I asked. Mark shrugged. No clue. I'll come back in a week and check the glue traps, but I don't think I'll find anything. I told him I'd call him if anything changed, and he left after a few more pets from the littles and a few more glowers from Calvin. That night, Calvin came up with another rat. I praised him again, but I was beginning to wonder where he was coming up with all these rats. By the end of the week, it was really starting to get out of hand. Calvin had brought me a total of 10 rats throughout the week, as well as 2 roaches and a grasshopper. He had eaten wet food every night that week, and the littles were clearly starting to feel some sort of way about it. They wolfed down their dry food, but I could see a lot of hooded glances towards Calvin as he dined on canned food. I was tempted to give them all wet food, but that would only make it harder to break the cycle once the rats stopped appearing. No, eventually Calvin would stop finding rats and bringing them to me, and the whole thing would just go away. Then, Hobbs decided to change the game. After feeding everyone and making sure their water bowls were full one night, I was heading to bed when I stopped in front of the door and looked for Calvin's latest offering. Calvin had been leaving me offerings there since the first night he had brought me the giant rat, and tonight was the first night in a while that I hadn't almost stepped on a dead mouse or a rat on the way to bed. I looked around, thinking he had left it near the door, but there was nothing. Calvin came up then, looking proud of himself, but seemed confused when he couldn't find anything. That's when Hobbs strolled up with a dead mouse swinging from his teeth. Hobbs laid the mouse at my feet, and I bent to congratulate him on his kill. He accepted my pets, eyes straying to Calvin, and I could swear that Calvin stared hatefully at him. It's hard to tell with cats sometimes. Their faces can be a little inexpressive if you're not used to them. Still, I saw Calvin crinkle his eyes and glower at Hobbs, the same way he had glowered at the exterminator. He sat on his bookcase and stared daggers at the little kitten as he ate his wet food. I looked at the two of them, wondering if I should leave them alone out here. I shrugged it off, though. They had never tried to hurt each other before, aside from some playful wrestling, and when Grayson followed me to bed, I tipped the door a little so they could come to bed when they were finished. The next morning, though, there was no sign of Hobbs. There was no sign of a struggle, either. Everything was as I had left it the night before. The door was locked, the floors were clean, nothing was amiss at all. It was as if Hobbs had simply vanished. I asked around the apartment complex, hoping maybe he had gotten out, but no one had seen hide nor tail of the little guy. I came home feeling very upset, and Grayson and Calvin tried their best to comfort me. I went to bed with Grayson curled up on my chest, missing the fluffy weight of Hobbs at my head. Calvin, however, stayed out in the living room. He seemed forever on the hunt these days. A week went by, and I still found myself filling Hobbs's bowl and calling for him at bedtime. Grayson was becoming standoffish towards Calvin. I usually came home to find them apart, staring at each other apprehensively. Calvin, on the other hand, pranced around like the lord of the house. There was at least one mouse or rat by the door of my room every night at bedtime, and Calvin was becoming larger than I thought a cat his size should be. He had been the size of a normal house cat a month ago, but now he was approaching the size of a small wild cat. I had chalked it up to all the wet food, but then the other rodents started showing up. On Monday, Calvin brought me a white rat. Calvin had started bringing them to me himself, lest we have another Hobbs incident where someone else took credit for his handiwork. When he set it down, I remembered thinking that it seemed oddly filled out for a wild rat. The rat had been taken care of and looked as though it had been fed regularly. I gave Calvin a hard look, but he only looked at me mildly with those amber eyes as if to say, "It's a rat, wet food now." I sighed and opened him a can, Grayson following closely at my heels as we went to bed. On Tuesday, Calvin brought me a squirrel. It was clearly a squirrel, though the tail had been chewed off. It wasn't a baby squirrel either, or some half-starved yearling. This was a full-grown squirrel that my cat was trying to pass off as a rat. I gave him the food, but I told him not to lure squirrels into the house anymore. He pretended to listen, relishing his wet food as he ate. On Wednesday, Calvin brought me a hamster. There was no disguising this one. He was red and white, his little cheeks stuffed with seeds, and by this point, I was making excuses. Maybe it had crawled in from the vents. Maybe someone's pet had gotten loose and wandered into the apartment. There was no way Calvin could get out of the apartment, right? On Thursday, Calvin brought me a guinea pig. He didn't even try to hide his smugness this time. Calvin flopped the fat little sausage of a rodent down and looked up at me expectantly. His eyes, had they always been that color? I remember them being more amber than crimson. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Perhaps I was just seeing things. My hands shook as I opened the can, and I closed the door this time as I went to bed. Calvin had grown another 3 inches seemingly overnight. and I was having a harder and harder time discerning his growth patterns without apprehension. Then, on Friday, I came home from work to find my landlord out in the hallway. I just thought I'd ask if maybe you'd seen my chinchilla. I told him I didn't know what a chinchilla looked like, to be honest, and he sighed. It's my daughter's. It's missing. I paid over $1,000 for that little monster, and now he's just suddenly disappeared. If you see him, please let me know. I was waiting for Calvin that night when he came trotting in, the chinchilla holed snugly between his teeth. That's when I lost my temper with him. I told him this was unacceptable. He couldn't just go around killing people's pets. He had probably been catching other pets and killing them as well, and I was tired of it. I grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, and Calvin yowled miserably as I dragged him to the pet carrier. I put him in and locked the door, the spring locks keeping it shut. He could spend the night in the carrier to think about what he had done. He yowled and morowled as Grayson and I went to bed. I heard him kicking around in there as I tried to sleep. After a little while, though, he quieted, and I finally went to bed. I woke up to an empty bed, though. I looked around for Grayson, expecting to have him curled up next to me, and finding nothing. Again, there was no sign of a struggle, no blood or evidence of foul play, just a lack of cat and a sense of absence. I left the room, my eyes inevitably straying to the cat carrier in the corner as I searched the house for Grayson. Calvin and Hobbs had been like children to me, but Grayson had been special, even amongst my cats. I felt like I had saved him, like I had kept him from dying, and now he was gone. I had to halt my search to stop myself from sobbing more than once. After I'd checked every room in the house, every hiding place, every nook and cranny, I turned my attention back to the pet carrier. It had been silent the whole time, unmoving and seemingly empty. I moved in slowly, not sure what to expect. Was Calvin dead too? He had spent a lot of time last night yowling, and now he was as silent as the grave. I bent low, putting my face near the mesh and looking in to find nothing. The pet carrier was empty. I jumped when someone knocked on my door, their thumping sounding frantic. It was the landlord again, and he looked very pale. "Excuse me, I'm going door to door. Have you seen, I mean..." He lost what little composure he had, and I felt his face press against my shoulder, his tears moistening my shirt. "My son's missing. Have you seen anyone who might have taken him? I put him to bed in his crib last night, and when I woke up this morning, he was just gone. His mother's nearly catatonic, and the police can't find any evidence of a break-in. I don't know what to do. I'm seeing if anyone has seen anything. It's all I know to do." I commiserated with him, telling him that I would let him know if I saw anything, but my guts were already a-roil with fear. Surely he hadn't. There was no way. He was there on the coffee table as I closed the door, tail flicking in agitation. There was something in his mouth, something thick and pink, and as he rose up and sauntered over to me, I backed away, not wanting to see what it was. He was leaving little red splotches on the floor in his wake as he carried the strange offering to me, and I was even more certain that I didn't want it anywhere near me. However, when my bottom came up hard against the door, I was out of room to retreat. He lay the offering at my feet, looking up coldly with none of his usual smugness, and staying put to watch as I pushed it over with the toe of my shoe. Even without the toes, I could tell it was a small, delicate foot that someone had unceremoniously detached from the owner. The foot of an infant, if I had to guess. He's out there now, eating his wet food as I lay in bed with the doors locked. I flushed the remains of the small foot down the toilet. It flushed surprisingly easy, but I saw Calvin watching me the whole time from the door. All he does now is watch me, and I'm frankly afraid to touch him. He's different, not really like a cat anymore, and when he tried to jump in my lap earlier, I pushed him away. I just can't stand to have him near me. However, I'll be giving him his wet food from now on, rat or no rat. I'm afraid of what might happen if I let him get too hungry.
I was almost giddy when the priest agreed to perform the exorcism. Father McGhee is actually fairly well known in the area. He had completed several rather public exorcisms, one of them on a councilman's daughter that had changed the girl so drastically that others had trouble disagreeing with his abilities. While some people believed he was just a well-meaning shyster, many people believed he was the real deal. He seemed to be just what I needed in my current situation. Sitting in his office at St. Marco's, it seemed oddly humble for a man like him. There was no extravagance in his office, only the humble set pieces of a public servant. The wall behind him held a picture of the softball team that he coached, of happy parishioners at a picnic, and smiling children at the hospital where he had gone to speak. He sat behind a very normal desk that you could have probably found at any IKEA, and his chair squeaked a little, letting me know that it had likely served him for quite some time. Sitting across from him, though, I could tell that he was anything but average. He seemed to exude power as he sat smiling at me, and I was confident that he was the right man for the job. "One of my parishioners said that you had reached out. What can I do for you today, my child?" I tried to find the best way to start, and finally decided to be honest with him. There's an entity in my house, one who has become darker and darker the longer he stays. He's entrenched himself, and I don't know how to get him out. The priest nodded, pulling out a notepad and taking a pencil from the holder. "Go on." It was nothing at first. Small offerings, things that didn't need to be in my house anyway. But he started hurting my cats, and now both of them are gone. It's not uncommon for entities like this to target small things that can't defend themselves. Has this entity taken up inside someone you love? A child or a wife, perhaps? Actually, it's taken up in one of my cats. The priest looked at me as if trying to see if he had misheard me. "I'm sorry, did you say a cat?" I nodded, certain now that he would laugh and tell me that I was overreacting. He would tell me to stop wasting his time and send me on my way. Then I'd have to go home to my apartment and look at that large orange feline and see the realization there. He would know what I had done, know where I had been, and I would likely suffer for it. To my surprise, the priest told me to tell him more, and I sighed in relief, glad to have someone who believed me. I had been living with Calvin for a year now, but the problem hadn't started until a few months ago. He was such a delight at first, he and his brothers filling my home with joy, but that was before he had begun to bring me gifts. Calvin loved the extra attention, loved the treats I gave him because of those gifts, and so he kept finding them, despite my confusion as to where they were coming from. I didn't mind, not much. Calvin was a good boy, and he was making the house safer by catching and bringing me his gifts. His brothers didn't understand. They were jealous of what he was getting, and that's likely what led to our current state of affairs. His brother had taken one of his gifts, and now he was gone. Very soon they were both gone, and Calvin's gifts became darker. Now he was bringing me things that I'm going to have to start having trouble explaining, and so I figured it was time to enlist the help of a professional. As I finished, the priest furrowed his brow and circled something on the notepad. "Are you sure it's the cat?" he asked. He didn't seem skeptical. He sounded more like he wanted to be sure before he made plans. "I am," I told him. "What makes you so sure? It could very well be someone breaking in and leaving these things. It could be something else entirely, something that you're not seeing." I shook my head. "It's definitely him, Father. The way he looks at me, the way he acts, it's all so different than it was before the rats. I don't know what it is. I don't know where it came from, but he's not the same cat that I took in a year ago. The anger and the heat in his eyes isn't something I've ever seen in a cat before. It's almost human, and its intensity, I don't know how much longer it'll be content to let me wander around in its space." Father McGhee nodded, putting the notebook into his pocket as he reached under the desk for a leather bag that Looked like a toiletry holder more than anything. Very well, let's go. I was speechless. Just like that? My son, I've been in this business for a long time. I've learned to read people, and I can see that whatever this presence is, demonic or not, you are terrified of it. If my presence will help alleviate that terror, then I owe it to you and to God to go and have a look. Believe it or not, my calendar isn't as full as some people might think. I have to be back for evening mass in a few hours, but until then, I can go and help you with your problem. He begged my patience for a few minutes, as he took out the stole of his office and checked the bag to make sure he had the things he would need. He took a tin from his desk, and I saw that it was full of the host, the wafers they use for communion. He took an old worn Bible from his desk and placed it under one arm, as he told me to lead the way. He rode with me to my apartment, and the second we came to the front, I knew something was off. The sky over St. Marco's had been blue and clear, but the sky over my apartment was full of angry clouds, and the wind that whipped the father's robes felt like a hurricane. The people inside looked out the window and marked us, more than a few of them crossing themselves as we walked inside. I think they had felt a darkness gathering around the apartment as well, and they hoped that Father Maxey might be able to dispel whatever had been haunting them. There were police cars in front of the main office, and I could see the officers inside talking to the building supervisor. I tensed as we walked past them, not sure what fresh hell had happened while I was away. "Gavin," said the building super, "these men are here about the disappearance of the girl in E12. You haven't seen her recently, have you?" He seemed almost hopeful, and why shouldn't he be? His own child, his newborn baby, had gone missing less than a month ago. It had put a pall over the whole building, and sometimes you could hear him roving up and down the halls, calling for her at night. The bottle in his hand led us all to believe that the drink had driven him to it. He hoped that maybe if they found this girl, the 9-year-old who had so often skipped down the stairs on her way to school, that they would find his baby as well. They would all be safe and sound together, and the girl's family wouldn't be the only one to have a happy reunion that day. I personally doubted they would ever find a trace of either of them, unless the offering I had flushed had made its way into the sewer somehow. I told him I didn't know, but I got the feeling that the priest didn't quite believe me. The police said that if I discovered any information, to let them know immediately, and I said that I would. One of them, an older cop with a salt and pepper mustache, didn't seem like he believed me either. But he let me leave, and as we went upstairs, the old priest asked me about it. "You suspect that the missing girl is connected with your problem, don't you?" I didn't look at him, but I nodded. I've found things in the apartment the last few weeks. Hair barrettes and small toys, a kid's shoe under the couch, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him about the little foot. And yet, you came to me instead of the police. I almost laughed. "Father, I barely thought you would believe me. Imagine what kind of luck I would have going to the cops and telling them that the missing children they've been searching for are being taken by a 20-pound house cat." He accepted my answer, but I started to wonder if I should have told anyone about it. I've been getting rid of things I find, putting them at the bottom of my garbage and praying that no one would find them. I knew what it would mean if they did. They might not believe that a cat had done it, but they would certainly believe that I had done it. They would find no evidence of my involvement, nothing besides Calvin's grisly trophies, but that would be enough. I'd be spending my time on death row after that, and Calvin would be free to roam again. We came out of the stairwell, and it almost seemed like the lights on my floor were dimmer. The budget for lights had likely never been very large, but a strange haze seemed to cover everything, and it made the whole floor look darker. I saw the father take something out of his pocket, and I was not surprised to see it was a crucifix. He had noticed it too, and he wasn't about to walk blindly into the den of evil. When we came to the door of my apartment, he put a hand on my shoulder as I slid the key in. "Open the door, but let me go in first." "Are you sure that's wise?" "I don't want whatever this is to have a chance to take you and make my job harder. Let me go in first, and follow behind me. I will do what must be done, and one way or another, your problems will be at an end." I didn't much care for the implications, but I suppose there was no other way. I turned the lock and opened the door. The darkness in the hallway had been nothing compared to the darkness in my apartment. It was the middle of the day. Even with the clouds outside, there should have been some ambient light. Instead, the inside of the apartment was as black as midnight. It almost felt like a blackout, but only for my particular unit. I reached in to try to flip the switch, but the priest pushed my hand away and stepped into the doorway. His crucifix sprung to life, the brightness that of a spotlight with a huge lumen count. Inside the apartment, I could see Calvin sitting on the back of the couch and looking questioningly at us. He had his head cocked to the side, as if to ask what we were doing, and it was such a normal gesture from a cat that I almost doubted what I had felt. Had I been wrong? Had I misread the situation? Now I had drugged this priest from his duties and wasted his time. I started to apologize to the old man, but one look at his face told me that he did not share my opinion. As he began to chant in low but solid Latin, Calvin went crazy. He fell off the back of the couch, beginning to roll on the hardwood, and as the priest advanced on him, he didn't let up at all. Calvin was writhing in pain, his eyes wide as if to ask what was happening. The priest took something out of the bag with his free hand, his eyes never leaving the cat. When he spritzed him with the holy water, Calvin rolled and leaped at him. It was so quick that I didn't think the priest had been expecting it, and when the scratch appeared on his cheek, he dropped the bottle and reeled back in pain. He never dropped the crucifix, though, the glowing talisman seeming to be a part of his body. Calvin scampered off into the house, and I could swear that the fur he left behind was singed. There was a smell in the air like burning hair, and as I made to go after him, the priest put an arm out to stop me. "Stay with me. He's a wily old soul. He'll have you if he's able, now that his latest form is compromised." He really is a demon, then?" I asked, not sure if I had ever really believed it. I was behind the priest as we tracked towards the kitchen, but I could still see his nod in the gloom. "There are many such demons who hide in animals, because they know it's not what humans expect. This allows them to work great evil, knowing that their unwitting owners will not believe that their favorite pet is capable of such things." As we came into the kitchen, I could see the light from the fridge as it suddenly spilled across the floor. The intrusion into the blackness made me nervous, but the priest seemed to expect it. He lifted some of the host from the tin, holding it like he meant to throw it. The harsh light was the only illumination in the space, but I instinctively looked up as we came in, catching the eyes just before he leapt. Calvin had always had a thing for being up high, and not a day went by that I didn't have to shoo him off the top of the cabinets. For an old guy, the priest was amazingly agile. He spun before I could even warn him, pressing the host to Calvin's face as he came screeching down on us. As it disintegrated, he grabbed him by the throat and bore him to the ground, pressing the crucifix to his brow as the cat clawed at him. I could see the priest's arm growing red as the skin was torn, but he held him against the linoleum, chanting Latin at the flailing beast. The cross glowed brightly, the harsh fluorescence sending steam up from the fluffy tom, and when his hand suddenly released, there was nothing left but some flying bits of fur and the harsh jingle of his collar as it fell to the ground. The priest sucked in a breath of pain, but smiled as he shook the remaining ginger strands from his fingers. "I'm sorry. It appeared that the demon wasn't inside your cat." I looked at him strangely, not quite getting it. The demon was your cat. I don't know why it took him so long to manifest, or even what brought it on, but your furry friend was of hell. I have sent him back, but if you notice anything strange in the future, don't hesitate to call me." He took his leave then, refusing any form of payment, and I'm happy to say that most of the oddities around the apartment have ceased. The girl from floor E was the last one to go missing, and some of that gloom that hung around the apartment has faded. No sign of the children was ever found, but I pray that their parents find some solace as time goes on. I got a dog to replace Calvin, a German shepherd that was looking for a good home, and he seems pretty happy to be my new friend. He does bark at nothing from time to time, especially in the kitchen, but I'm sure that's just a normal thing for dogs to do. I miss Calvin sometimes, and I still mourn him and his brothers and the lives that were lost to this hell kitty, but I'm sure that he's where he belongs now. Susan smiled as she watched Gus paw at his reflection in the mirror. "Did you find another cat to play with?" she asked, and Gus looked back with a meow before pawing at his reflection again. She was glad that Gus had found someone to play with, even if it was just his reflection. Gus had been depressed lately. They say that having only one cat could lead to this sort of thing. Cats are social animals, after all. Gus couldn't really play with any of the strays outside Susan's apartment, because she was on the 3rd floor, and a little out of reach for even the most nimble of the wandering felines. That didn't stop Gus from standing on her balcony, though, meowing at the cats below and trying to get their attention. Susan thought it was kind of sad, watching him paw at the screen as he called down to the cats who lived their lives in blissful freedom. But the apartment contract had been very clear on their 1 pet per unit policy, and Susan didn't want to move just so Gus could have a playmate. Gus was a big orange tomcat that Susan had found wandering near her parents' house before she moved out. He'd been a scrawny little kitten when she'd found him, and she had fallen in love with him almost instantly. Susan had just gone through a bad breakup when she had stumbled across the sad little kitten near the garbage cans one morning. The little fuzzball had helped her get through her loneliness, and she liked to think that she had helped him as well. When she moved out of her parents' house at the end of the year, Susan had taken the little cat with her. She and Gus had been roommates ever since. Gus was a great companion, and didn't seem prone to the midnight zoomies or the sometimes destructive behavior her friends complained about in their cats. Gus liked his scratching post, snuggling in bed with Susan until it was time for her to get up, and eating his own food instead of hers. His only real issue seemed to be his loneliness, and Susan could hardly hold that against him. Watching him play with his reflection in the mirror was as cute as it was sad, like a kid playing with his imaginary friend because he couldn't seem to make any real ones. Susan watched him as she got ready for work, and she pulled out her phone as she took some video for Instagram. The scrawny little kitten had grown into a regal orange ball of fur, and to watch him paw at the surface of the mirror was insanely cute. He would cock his head and meow at his reflection sometimes, looking confused at the cat in the mirror, before going back to pawing at the glass. Susan smiled, but there was something just a little off-putting about that confused head turn now and then. She left him staring at himself in the mirror, his game forgotten, as he seemed to be talking to the orange cat in the mirror. Susan came home to find him still sitting in front of the mirror. She asked him if he'd been there all day, and Gus just looked back and meowed before looking back at the mirror again. He was staring at himself, his ears moving back and forth, seeming to Susan like he was having a conversation with his reflection. Growing up with cats, she had seen them sit next to each other and do just that same thing, and Gus's eye contact was more than a little interesting as he watched himself in the mirror. She tried to ignore him as she slid into her PJs, but it was hard the longer it went on. "Come on, Gus, want to watch a movie with me?" she said, patting the bed as she fiddled with the TV. Gus looked up, meowing happily, but then turned back to the mirror and did an oddly unsure little head cock as he took a few steps towards the bed. In the end, Susan had to come get him and take him over to the bed as the poor old Tom watched the mirror. Susan saw nothing out of the ordinary, the mirror cat just scooped up by her own mirror reflection, but this behavior was wandering into the realm of creepy rather than cute. Gus sat with her happily as Susan watched Friends for the 1000th time, but she caught him glancing back at the mirror more than once as she stroked his silky fur. He wasn't the only one. Susan couldn't help but glancing at it as well, looking at the mirror as if she expected to see something out of the ordinary. She didn't, but it was definitely starting to creep her out. Susan let her keys fall into the bowl by the door, calling for Gus as she slid her shoes off. It had been such a long day. A creepy old man had hit on her at work, the customers were rude, and Susan sometimes wondered why she didn't just quit. She could do better than an assistant manager at a grocery store, and she knew it. If it hadn't been for Gus in this apartment, she'd have likely walked away a while ago. Speaking of Gus, where the heck was he? He almost always came to greet her at the door.
She called him again, but there was no response. She went to the bedroom and huffed out in mock outrage when she saw him sitting in front of the mirror again. Okay, Furface, this is getting to be a little much. It was cute at first, but now it's super creepy. He meowed pitifully when she picked him up, pawing gently as he tried to get away, but she took him over to the bed and sat down with him. He watched her dutifully as she got changed, his fluffy head turning back to the mirror from time to time as Susan slid into her pajamas. And she couldn't help but glancing at it as well. She wasn't sure, but felt like she could see something moving there when she wasn't giving it her full attention. The mirror was the large rolling kind that the apartments often came with, the one on the closet doors. You could see the whole room in it, and it slid to the side on tracks if you needed something out of the closet. It was a nice amenity to have when you were getting ready in the morning, but it was starting to creep Susan out the longer she looked at it. She got that spidery feeling as she put her back to it, like something was watching her. When she pulled her hair into a ponytail and turned to put it up, she almost dropped her scrunchie. Gus was staring at her, head cocked, as he watched her from the front of the mirror. She stepped back, startled, and when her legs bumped against the chair in front of the vanity, she sat down hard. Something came off the bed then, and she heard Gus meowing as he looked at her as if to ask if she was okay. Susan looked back at the mirror and saw that it was empty again, save for her own surprised face and the furry reflection of Gus as he stood by her leg. That night was the first time she covered the mirror. She took some thumbtacks and an old throw blanket and used them to cover the surface. It was silly. She knew it was silly. But she felt better when the mirror's surface wasn't looking at her anymore. Gus walked over to inspect her work, and Susan picked him up as he began to paw at the blanket. Gus would just have to get over it, she thought, and she took him to bed and put something on to distract her and her fears. As she scratched his ears, she felt better, and as the night went on, she almost forgot all about her silly fears from earlier. When she woke up, though, she saw that the blanket had been pulled down, and Gus was again talking to himself. This became a daily routine for her. The first thing she did when she got up or got home from work was to cover the mirror and tell Gus to stop pulling the blanket down. Gus would meow when she did this, looking at the blanket and pawing at the covered surface of the mirror, but Susan was unmoving in her decision to keep the blanket up. She would usually pick Gus up as he pawed pathetically at the blanket and take him off to pet him, but it never stopped him from coming back to it. It never stopped him from uncovering it again, and Susan just accepted that this was Gus's new obsession. The cuts on her big fur ball were a little harder to ignore, though. Sometimes, while stroking his silky fur, Susan would encounter a scratch or a bite and wonder how exactly he had gotten it. They weren't the sort of wounds a cat could get from just scratching themselves. At least she didn't think they were. When she noticed a bite on the tip of his ear one afternoon, she actually searched the house to see if another cat might have gotten in somehow. His food bowl never emptied any quicker than usual, and there was never any extra scat in the box. If there was some secret cat living in the house, it was extremely quiet when she was there. The only strange thing was Gus's melancholy seemed to have disappeared. His mood had improved, and he spent less time meowing to the cats below the balcony. The only change was that she had to shoo him away from the mirror constantly. If he wasn't in her lap being petted, Gus was at the mirror or at the blanket that covered it. He never took it down while she was there, but he would put his face underneath it or just stare at it like he could hear someone talking. Susan found this extremely off-putting, but what could she do? The mirror was attached to the closet door, and without it, Gus would be free to leave his long orange fur all over her clothes that she had hanging in there. Also, as much as it creeped her out, she couldn't stand to think of Gus being sad again while she was at work. Then, one day, something changed. She came home to find the blanket down and Gus looking at himself as he always did. "Seriously, Gus? This is getting annoying. I hate having to put this blanket back up every..." But she stopped when Gus turned his amber eyes to stare at her. The two held their gaze for a few moments, but Susan couldn't help but hear the voice of her subconscious as it screamed that this wasn't her cat. It looked like Gus, it sat like Gus, and was a perfectly adorable little ball of orange fluff, but his eyes were different. They were the same amber gold they had always been, but today they were filled with hate. No, not hate, Susan supposed. It was something else, like a king looking at a mud-covered serf. Not with pity, and certainly not with any desire to help it. Gus looked at her with scorn and something akin to disgust. How exactly a cat could portray these things with its fuzzy little face, Susan didn't know, but that's what it was. Gus loathed her. She suddenly caught him by the scruff, and when he hissed at her, Susan realized it was the first time she'd heard him do that. He swiped a fat ginger paw at her, and Susan almost dropped him as his claws sliced her wrist. Gus growled and cried in his angry little voice, a voice that was suddenly less cute than usual, and Susan tossed him into the hall and closed the door. Gus bumped at it, hissing and yowling, and Susan was surprised when she realized that her back was against the door. It was like she thought he might just come through the door. She locked it just in case and walked into her bathroom as she washed the cut with soap and water. It wasn't very deep, but the 3 long scratches had been right across her wrist. She had just finished putting some Bactine on it and looking for a Band-Aid when she heard Gus's pitiful meow from the other room. That sounded more like the lovable fluff Susan knew, so she slapped the Band-Aid on and went to open the bedroom door. Perhaps she had just startled him as he had startled her. She hadn't grabbed him by the scruff of the neck since he was a kitten, and he was quite a bit heavier now. Susan suddenly wondered if maybe she had hurt him, and she opened the door as she prepared to pull him into a hug. "Sorry, Gus, you just scared me. I wasn't—" But she opened the door and noticed that he wasn't there. She checked the hallway, but Gus was nowhere to be found. Susan shrugged, tallying it up to strange cat behavior, and finished doctoring her arm before going to start dinner. As she cooked, she kept expecting to see Gus come out and sniff or rub up against her leg. Gus was always so curious, and he always came to have a look when she was cooking or watching TV. He had even jumped into the shower with her a few times, though he always instantly regretted it. She began to feel guilty about what had happened earlier and just wanted to find him so she could pet him and say she was sorry. Even so, those weird eyes kept coming back to her. She couldn't shake the idea that that cat hadn't been her Gus. She didn't see him again until she was cleaning up and getting ready to take the garbage out. Susan was in a bit of a hurry as she tied the bag up and started pulling it out of the can. The plastic pan the chicken had come in had likely leaked into the bottom of the bag, and she wanted to get it to the dumpster before it dripped onto the floor. She hadn't seen Gus since she'd put him out, not even as she ate chicken Alfredo on the couch. He was likely still sulking somewhere, but she figured he'd come out when it was time for bed, and all would be forgiven by tomorrow. She thought she might have heard him, though, and he sounded upset wherever he was. Susan had cocked an ear several times as she cooked, listening to the meows of a familiar cat from the back of the house. She had called him, even taken the tuna he liked to coax him out, but he had never poked his head out or shown any interest in any of it. Susan had looked all over for him a few times, but as the sound of her sauce bubbling began to sound more like burning, she always returned to the stove. She walked to the door with her swinging bag of trash, and when the door came open with a loud creak, she heard claws scrabbling on linoleum. Susan saw an orange lightning bolt come barreling out from behind the china cabinet and make a break for the open door. She moved purely by chance, and Gus hit the trash bag as he yowled and smacked against the cans and packages inside. Susan dropped the bag, no longer mindful of the chicken drippings, and reached for Gus before he could escape. He had never tried to run away before, not even as a half-starved little kitten, and when her hands settled around him, he yowled and slashed at her furiously. He clawed at her hands, swiped at her face, and Susan stepped back when one paw scored her across the cheek and thought about the garbage a little too late. Whether it was the chicken leavings or some other liquid, Susan felt her feet shoot out from under her as she fell against the china cabinet. Her head smacked against the bulky old thing, and everything went fuzzy as she watched Gus run off into the night. She called his name distantly before passing out and waking up somewhere very different. Susan woke up in the hospital. Her mom was reading a magazine, but as Susan groaned, she called for the nurse and leaned in to have a look at her. The nurse came on the run, and Susan was soon poked and prodded and examined by her mother and several people in scrubs. She was confused and a little scared, and when she asked what had happened, it took her dad coming in from the cafeteria to shed any light on the situation. The complex had called her parents, since they were her emergency contact, to let them know that a neighbor had found her passed out in her doorway. They had called an ambulance, and she had been rushed to the ER with a head wound. She had spent 3 days unconscious, her concussion pretty substantial, and her parents had been worried sick. She asked her dad if he'd been to the apartment, and if he'd seen Gus, but he said he hadn't done much more than put some food in a bowl and lock the place up. "He's probably okay, sweetie. Cats are pretty self-reliant. I'll go back tonight and make sure he has food and water, though." They wanted to keep her at the hospital until they were sure that she was okay, but Susan was adamant that she needed to leave. Gus had gotten out, and she needed to find him.
He had been scared by the garbage bag and startled when she grabbed him. He hadn't meant to scratch her. He was probably cold and scared and waiting for her to come home, and she started to cry when they told her it would be a few more days before she was released. Her dad didn't help matters much. He checked on Gus, but said that he must have gotten out. His food bowl was still full, and he hadn't come home when her dad had called him. He had looked around, but he hadn't seen any sign of him. "I'm sure he's just scared and waiting for you to come back. He'll probably meet you at the door when you come home from the hospital," he assured her, his face showing a lot of worry. She came home 3 days later, after the hospital had run every test they could think of, and Susan was greeted by nothing but a plain beige door and a note from her neighbor wishing her a speedy recovery. She opened the front door thinking maybe he would be there, but the house was cold and empty. It felt lonely without Gus there to welcome her, and she decided then that she had to go look for him. Maybe he was close by, playing with the cats he had seen from the balcony. She would get some treats and call him, and hopefully he would come back after some coaxing, and they could be a family again. She was halfway down the hallway when she recognized a pitiful meow from her bedroom. She came through the door looking frantically for Gus. Had he gotten stuck in the bedroom? How had he been eating and drinking this whole week? She expected that he would come pelting out when the door opened, but he was nowhere to be found. She started looking for him under the bed and in the closet, but when the same sad meow came from behind her, she turned and found the source. It was Gus. He was just as fluffy as she remembered him, and it broke her heart to see how thin he looked under all that fur. He looked troubled, his eyes darting around as he put a paw up and pleaded for her to help him. He looked sorry, like he would do anything if she could just help him out of this. And as she approached him, Susan could feel her tears coming down in a torrent. Gus pressed his paw against the mirror. His toes were visible from the other side, and as he pressed and shoved, she could see he was becoming upset. Gus was stuck inside the mirror, his world nothing more than a little room, the one he had loved so much. Susan put a hand up to the mirror, covering his little paw with hers, and only then noticed that she didn't have a reflection. She sat and wondered if she'd have to watch her poor cat Gus waste away, unable to help him, and she laid her forehead against the glass as she cried all the harder.